205.
Okay.
So my favorite thing is answering questions.
Good.
Really, I love to answer
when
questions.
you have a live, very fine poet standing right in front of you.
I'll be fine. You better hope your dean ain't here. You gonna get in trouble.
Oh my goodness. Well, you know, I just call it like it is.
Yeah, you got
Just call it like it is. All right. So, you know, I'm ad-libbing a little bit because I know it always takes about 2 minutes before you really get a question. I mean, when somebody says, okay, there's question and answer, you get panicky. Oh my God, I'd like to ask a question, but I can't think of one right now. So I've talked long enough. There's somebody out there who wants to say, ask something of Jericho Brown. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jim.
The rhythm of preaching in southern mountains and farther south often involves that kind of combination of rhythm and pause that forces the listener to think of the word more carefully than when it rolls out in long sentences. And I wondered, you do that so very well. Does that come from a conscious way of doing it? Does it just come naturally to you? I'm just interested in how that comes into your performance as well as in poetry.
Yeah, it's actually half of each. And I think I think this is a good question, not just about the performance of poetry, but also the writing of poetry. While poetry requires some amount of talent, it also requires some amount of skill, of craft. And I think, you know, the best way for me to talk about this is to talk about basketball. So if you excuse me for a second. You know, LeBron James. Y'all act like y'all never heard of LeBron James? Maybe y'all, okay. So LeBron James, when it's time for LeBron James to make a jump shot, when he sees that opportunity, he doesn't stop and think, oh, this might be a good chance. He's not like, I wonder if you know, but his ability to do that his ability to just know that it's like in the moment that opportunity is there, to take that opportunity and to do that has to do with the fact that he's practiced it over and over again with his team and with teams before that, including the one he abandoned, but that's another story. So I'm a bad person. And so I think the more I read, the more I am aware of how those intonations serve me. And so I try to make use of them as well as I can, because I know that is also a part of me. So it's something I partially use and that I partially... The last time I went to church, I went to this church in Atlanta called New Beginnings Full Gospel Baptist Fellowship. St. Matthew's. No. It was this really long name. But anyway, the pastor there, I'll never forget, it was so funny to me. He's like, you know, doing the sermon. And he got to a point, he said, well, hold up here. He said, now I know I'm taking a long time and I know I've gone over my time, and right here it says I'm supposed to whoop. so he like literally has it in his notes, whoop here. Like, you know, this is the part where you start hollering and it acted crazy. You know, and so I think that's so interesting, because when you're sitting in the audience, you feel like that whoop, although it happens every Sunday, you feel like, oh, this happened out of like magic. Like, oh wow, look at that. He just called that up. And so I really do think it's half of each. You have to be in a constant state of reading and a constant state of writing. And you have to be in a constant state of observance as a poet. But you also, I think, have to be aware of what your abilities are. As with anything else, you know, you have to know what your strengths are, and then you exercise your strengths. Thank you so much. Yes, ma'am.
I'm teaching a class on African American poetry, and you mentioned Langston Hughes and I wondered if you could tell us about some of the other African American poets who have been important to you in your writing over the years.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so this list is really long. Right? So, Langston Hughes is actually my first poet. When I say first poet, I mean that the way we think of like first love or first kiss. I remember sitting in the library. I'm from a family where I was fortunate enough to have a mother who couldn't afford childcare, which meant that when she needed someone to watch me and my sister, we got dropped off at the library. And it was long ago enough to, now when you go in the library, I don't know if you've been in the library lately, when you go in the library, there's nothing there but computers. But it was long ago enough to where we would go to the library, there was nothing there but, it was amazing. Books. And I remember coming across Langston Hughes's poems and just being like, this guy's like Langston Hughes. What? And I had this idea that I could like call him on the phone or like, and I remember going to mom and my mother and being like, oh, I want to go over to Langston Hughes's house. Like, you know, like we can, the way that I encountered these books was as if, oh, all these people are just like people, and I could just like go be cousins with them or something. So, but Langston Hughes is obviously a huge influence for me. Gwendolyn Brooks, I think is very important to me because she so often thinks in a poem. By that, what I mean is if you read a poem like The Mother, you see that speaker change her mind 9 times. And the entire time she's changing her mind, you don't get bored with it. You know, like when you're with somebody in line at Burger King and they keep changing their mind, you want to slap them in the mouth. You don't feel that way while you read the book. Lucille Clifton, I think, is a very important poet for me, partially because of her use of brevity in the poems. Also, it was very important for me because I come from this very religious family. Poets, as I said, we have to use our strengths. And so one of the things I've always had some sort of, some relationship to and some sort of knowledge of is the Bible. And Clifton was the first poet that I'd ever come across who's actually making use of the Bible in her poems, you know, these poems in the voices of people like Mary and Adam and Eve, and it's just the most amazing revelation for me to encounter her work. Younger poets that I've always, there's a poet that I want everybody to read that nobody is reading, or not reading enough of, definitely, and that's the poet Russell Atkins, who is about to, I think, make a really huge comeback. I'm working with some people on a book of essays, and we're doing some work to recover his work, his very strange and audacious poems, these amazing leaps from one thing to the next thing, and yet, in spite of all those leaps, you know how to stay inside the poem. Younger poets that I love are, of course, Terrence Hayes, who has been like a big brother to me since I was a kid. Terrence Hayes really made me feel like poets were part of a family, to the point where when I meet a poet, I'm like, oh, this is you, hey, oh, you know. And I'll never forget. Terrence Hayes lived in New Orleans for a while I was living in New Orleans, and he lent me this book, and I needed to bring his book back to his house. And I came to the house and I'm like, you know, sort of, by the way, Terrence Hayes is like 9 feet tall or something like that. So I'm like, oh my God, I don't, you know. So I like leave the book in the mailbox and I'm like running out to my car. And he's hanging out of the window like, hey, where you going? You just gonna bring the book back? Don't you think we ought to talk about the book? But not just him, but also his poems are absolutely heartbreaking. And he has this poem that recently came, that he recently published in an online journal that all of you can find. I'm pretty sure the title of the poem is "We Should Make a Documentary About Playing Spades." And so that, I think, gives you a pretty good idea of the kind of thing he's interested in. And then poets like Natasha Trethewey, the way she deals with the elegy and with grief and with history, the way she is so staunchly a Southern poet a poet reclaiming Southern poetry in this way and naming it as a large part of her own tradition. She's been very important to me as a poet. So, is that enough?
Yeah.
I can keep going.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, sorry.
Hi, so I feel like in classes you learn a lot about being able to really pull apart a poem, and I feel like in my experiences with kind of having a really academic perspective from reading poems, I have gotten a lot out of poetry, but I feel like there's also a lot of poems that basically say that to not do that. How as a poet would you like people to read your poetry, and how do you think you really should just approach poetry?
Yeah, so I think, how do I start this? I have a lot to say about poetry in classrooms, because it's something that students, and even teachers, I think, are horrendously afraid of. Part of the reason why they're afraid of is that somebody, and I don't know, it's like, I feel like it's the same person. I really do, like I get an image of like this really, really evil guy with a long nose and a mole at the end of the nose. Do you know what I mean? Like there's somebody who like just took a poem and just beat them with it or something, like when they were in the 2nd grade. And ever since then, they're like, poetry, no, thank you. You know, it's like, it's gonna hurt them in some way. So when I teach poetry, what's most important to me is that my students can tell me what is happening in the poem. That is the 100%, what is the dramatic situation of the poem? Often because of much of the taking apart of a poem that you are speaking of. We're going to get to why that's necessary in a minute, or how that's necessary in a minute. But often what I think happens with students is they've been taught either by that guy who beat them over the head with a poem, or by somebody else who told them that the poem is whatever you want it to be. And then after they said that, they curtsied. And so many of my students, the first line of the poem will say, a dog is walking down the street. And I'll say, so what's happening in this poem? And they'll say, well, this guy's brokenhearted because his woman left him. This is a true story. The first line of the poem will say, she walked in and turned on the light. And I'll say, so what's happening in the poem? Well, obviously her grandmother died. And so, like obviously? And so I think that's the something that many teachers are trying to counter. And what is very important is that we read poems and that we understand that, like anything else we read, things happen in them. Real things go down in poems, right? If I were to ask you, like if you see a movie and I ask you what happens in the movie, you can tell me what happens in the movie. I was talking on the airplane over here about the latest Denzel Washington movie, Flight, with the flight attendant, and she was complaining about it because she was like, this couldn't happen and that couldn't happen, and this would never be. But it was really actually funny to me. But we were talking about the scenes in the movie, right? We talked about the part where this happens or the part where that happens. Do you know what I'm saying? And students need to be able to do that. I mean, in terms of the taking apart of the poem. Now, this is what I think happens in the classroom, and this is what college, part of what an undergraduate education I think should be about. Going to school is like being a plant. But it's like being a plant in a greenhouse, right? So what would have happened in the past is you would have read a poem and been like, okay, the man turned on the light switch, and you would put the poem down. Do you understand what I'm saying? And then, you think about like a line from that poem, and you think, oh, the man turned on the light. Line break. switch and then changed into a woman right away. Do you understand what I mean? And so you begin to see that line break in a different way because it's on the same line with and then changed into a woman. Do you understand what I'm saying? But that's the kind of thing that because you have a professor, because you have other students in the class, you don't have to wait on your own to do. That's the thing we're all supposed to be helping one another do. And so that is not to nail down meaning in a poem. There's a poem I love by William Carlos Williams called Danse Russe. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. It might be Danse Russe. It's D-A-N-S-E, and then the second word is R-U-S-S-E, right? Which is something like the Russian dance or something like that. And part of the reason I love the poem is that the dramatic situation of the poem is this guy doing this thing that everybody does but nobody ever admits to doing. He's in the mirror naked, like waving his shirt. This happens in I'm not being pornographic, this just happens in the poem. This, I swear you should read this poem, it's a great poem. But at some point in the poem he says, I am lonely, I am best so, right? And that, what I love about that moment is, it's for me, it's sort of the definition of what Keats might call negative capability. In that, when you read that poem, when one of us sees, I am lonely, I am best so, that one of us might have an idea that what he means is this thing. And that one of us would be able to support that meaning with everything else that's going on in the poem. Do you understand what I'm saying? Whereas another one of us would have a different idea of what he means by I am lonely, I am best so. It's very different from saying I am alone, I am best so. He knows what he's doing. He's William Carlos Williams, fair to say. I imagine he's got an understanding of it. Do you understand what I mean? So that's not to say that you have to nail down meanings in poems, but that is to say that when he says, at the moment, there's a part of the poem where he says, I admire myself in the mirror. That's not really up for discussion. When he says, I stand naked before the mirror and admire myself, my shirt over my head. His shirt is over his head. He says he's twirling his shirt over his head. I don't have to have a big long conversation about that. The conversation comes when it's time to talk about, I am lonely, I am best so. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I think that's what I think. About that. Did I answer your question?
One more question. Yes.
You can ask me back here. Cool. Okay.
Right back here, yes.
I'm in a class kind of comparing and contrasting visual space poems like on the page and then like performance poetry. And I was just curious, like, what and why, but which one would you choose? And like, do you even see a difference between the two?
Okay, what do you mean by visual space poem? Do you mean like a conceptual poem, or do you mean like a concrete poem?
Like I'll just use one. Like, imagine like I'm writing a poem about nuclear warfare, and the poem is like
in the shape of a mushroom.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Now, what are you asking me? I just was lost in what you said, the first part, so I was like,
is there a difference? Like, are there even two like different
between that and performance poetry?
Yes.
Well, I mean, what's interesting, my idea of performance poetry is that performance poetry is, the experience we have with performance poetry is different in that it is meant to be performed, right? And now, let me say this about all poetry as far as I'm concerned. And this is my own poetics, and y'all are welcome to disagree with me, right? Go say I said this, and write a blog about how you think I'm wrong. But all poems are meant to be heard aloud, right? But there is nothing in the world like the experience we have. It's a very intimate experience. I mean, when I say intimate, like it's like somebody's there. The experience we have when we are reading a poem on the page, right? So my idea, for instance, like the first time I read Emily Dickinson, nobody was there saying to me what Emily Dickinson had written on the page. I mean, this is the same experience I had the first time I read Sylvia Plath. There was nobody like in the room but me, but I heard it. Like the sound, the rhythms, the music of those poems came off the page into my ears, and nobody was talking, and I'm not making that up. And if y'all have not had that experience with a poem, you are reading the wrong poets. Do you understand what I'm saying? So from what I know of performance poetry is that performance poetry is meant to be spoken before it is meant to be read on the page, right? That's not that it's somehow better or worse, right? Now I have something to say about this, I guess what I'm thinking of is a kind of concrete poetry, and that is that often the problem, what happens is people get excited about shape making as opposed to making lines or making sentences or having an engagement with language. Do you understand what I'm saying? So for me to enjoy a poem, I have to have an engagement with language, no matter whether the poem is in the shape of a mushroom or if the poem is just flush left, as we think of traditional poems being on the left side of the margin. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, that's my answer. Is that good? Do I have to stop answering questions? Do they want to, like,
Sign books.
oh, I need to sign, so I do have to sign.
Let's thank Jericho Brown one more time.